Welcome to the Agility in Real Life podcast, Take 5 in Real Life. Now your hosts, Mike Studeman, Jeff Lee, and Pat Campbell.
Hello, and welcome back to the Take 5 IRL podcast, Take 5 in Real Life from Agility IRL. I'm Jeff Lee, one of the partners at Agility IRL and one of your hosts.
Good to see you, Jeff. And I'm Pat Campbell, another partner at Agility IRL.
All right. And if you've been following our podcast lately, you know our names and what we do here. You also know that we've been talking about medical device a fair amount. And at Agility IRL, here in the Minneapolis area, we have a lot of medical device companies. We spend a lot of time helping them be more agile. And we get beyond software, right? With these companies and the medical devices, we get into firmware, we get into hardware, and we often get questions on the unique challenges of working with firmware and hardware and how to be agile. So Pat, are there simple rules for that? Can we just follow a recipe cookie cutter sort of thing?
Oh, would that we could, right, Jeff? That would be nice. But the good news is a lot of the principles and practices that we espouse and coach at Agility IRL translate as well into the firmware and the hardware space, just maybe not as we're used to in the software space. And that's one of the things that we've tried to help these companies with is to understand how to do it across the entire product.
Right. Yeah, you can't just do the software part and be agile, right? It doesn't help you get your next version of your product out there. So what kind of things, what kind of challenges do you find that the hardware side brings?
Well, the hardware obviously has is a little less malleable than software, obviously, and so that introduces some changes. Firmware is dependent upon electrical circuit boards, and also, again, not as malleable as just pure software. So that has to be taken into account. In fact, it's kind of funny. There's a term we do in the pure software space we refer to as VUCA, which is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And actually, that's around business agility, enterprise agility, and the need to be agile as an enterprise in the face of VUCA. There's a parallel acronym in the engineering space, the systems engineering space, which is the term CURVE, which involves capriciousness, uncertainty, risk, variation, and evolution, all of which relate to the development of systems for medical devices. So even
Those all
at
sound
that
like
level, there's parallels.
they all sound like somewhat scary things here. Capriciousness, uncertainty, risk. Uh, there's, yeah. So how do we deal with this, right? We can understand similar things to what you talked about with the VUCA acronym. It comes to, there's a lot of unknowns, right? Things
Mhm.
that can, risks, things that can pop up and hurt us down the road. So with all these unknowns, we can't just go out and put together a Gantt chart and expect it to come true. What are some of the principles that you see that translate from the agile world to working with firmware and hardware?
Well, if you recall that famous graph that shows the more complex you get in efforts, the more you need agility. It draws in those same principles and practices as a result. Small batches with incremental evolution of a solution based on feedback early and often. And of course, we are comfortable with that in the software space. We're less comfortable with that in the firmware and the hardware space. But there are principles and practices that are applied in a little bit different way, but still the same principles and practices. As an example, cross-functional collaboration, in this case, not just between software and test in the same team, but software and firmware and hardware engineers on the same team. And also in close proximity physically, if they're working in the same office for that exchange of ideas. I mean, that's just a foundational one.
Yeah, for that one, it goes back to the fast feedback cycles that you talked about, right? If we're working together, if we're making little changes and see how it works, we're learning as we go. And
Mhm.
the quicker those feedback cycles, the less our risk, because we're resolving some things that were unknown become known. Whether it's a good known or a bad known, it's now known, and that does reduce our risk.
Exactly. And um, another approach to doing that is the continuous integration that you do in the firmware space. There's something called a field programmable gate array. They call it FPGA for short. Allows you to reconfigure, basically reconfigure circuit boards after being manufactured so that you can test different versions of firmware against it, or completely simulate the electrical environment in a computer so that you can run against it. So those are ways to drive that continuous feedback loop, only in a firmware space.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Can you say what that is again too, in case people are looking into, we're going to go deeper into some of these concepts in future episodes, but what was that was the term for people who want to learn more about it themselves?
Field programmable gate arrays, or FPGA. I suspect if you're already in the industry, you're comfortable with it, but
Fair point.
it's just an example of a tool that can be used to establish that continuous integration feedback loop
All right.
on,
What are
on
some
the
other
hardware
principles
side
and
as well.
practices?
I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, cue you up. What are some other principles and practices?
Hardware is the same way. It's less malleable, but that means you want to try to implement multiple models or multiple experiments, if you will, and not do big upfront design, not pick one design and try to follow it all the way through, only to find it's not going to work at the end, but to try a couple different versions, experiment across all of them until you find the one that's most promising.
Yeah, I will mention I worked at with an organization that was working on, they had an imaging solution, right? They had version 1.0 that was out there in the market. It was first to market. They were doing very well with it. And they were working on version 2.0 and they were stuck. They were, it was 2 years. They didn't have anything else, any other releases queued up, and they didn't have a path to get to a release. What they ended up doing, because they were stuck, there were two different technologies to work with. They had an electronic version and they had a magnetic version of this solution, and
Mhm.
they weren't sure which path to take, so they took both of them. And they ran sprints and they learned things as they went, and at a certain point they had to make a decision, but they decided to explore both options.
No, that's a perfect example, and I probably couldn't have come up with a better one. So yeah, that's how you do it in the hardware side. Deferring that decision until the last responsible moment is one way of describing it,
Mhm.
and I love that description because it really reflects it. And then on the documentation side, in the medical device arena, there's elements of medical devices that are embedded in the human body or attached to it. That's going to require quite a bit more um, commitment to the regulatory process, obviously. And so you've got to make sure that you iterate the documentation along with the rest of the product as an element of the product, and not end up trying to do it all at the end.
That's a great point. Thinking about the documentation as part of the product. And so whenever, whether you're working in sprints or some sort of iterative process, not consider an iteration done until the documentation is caught up. You're not done unless the documentation's there. It's part of your product. That's a really important point.
Yeah, and finally, you know, being very careful about the user stories and acceptance tests, making sure they're very clear and agreed upon between the product side and the QA side, so that they're written in a way that reflects what's trying to be accomplished, and but in parallel, the testing strategy and tests themselves are clearly defined. Help clarify the definition of done for those user stories, so everybody is moving along at the same pace, in sync of their understanding.
Yeah, and going back to a couple of previous points that we've made on this, right? Like if I go back to that example of the company that had the magnetic and the electric versions, right? The user story should be the same. what is the business outcome we're trying to achieve, regardless, and not getting into the how. How do we go about doing this from a technical point of view? And then you also touched again on the collaboration. We need to have all the people who are involved up front putting together these user stories and understanding them. This goes back to a common question we get with Agile and software side, wherever, about who writes the user stories. Well, it should be a collective effort, right? Getting all the collective knowledge involved.
Yep. Yeah, I've often heard it referred to as the three amigos. The product owner, the software developer, and the QA person. So, but of course, the bad news, if you want to call it bad news, is that all of these things will oftentimes represent change to an organization trying to move in this direction. And just like with Agile in a pure software environment, Agile in a medical device environment is going to require change, which will sometimes be resisted, but must be managed through to success if you're going to successfully move to a Agile enterprise in the med device marketplace.
Yeah, managing change, that's another series of podcasts all in and of itself.
Yep, that's probably one we'll want to queue up in the near future.
Good. Well, I hope this was a valuable overview for people and a little bit of a preview of what's to come in our upcoming episodes regarding hardware, firmware, and being Agile in that world. So thanks for joining us again on the Take5IRL podcast.
Thank you all.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Take5IRL podcast. If you like it, please go ahead and share it with someone, as well as like and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Also, leave us a comment or a suggestion for a future episode. Again, thanks for listening, and we look forward to you joining us next time on the Take5IRL podcast.